For my research project, I decided to explore the media coverage of terrorist attacks in different areas of the world and analyze how the media of different regions covers these attacks. I was inspired to do this project because of my personal observations following the Paris terror attacks, which received a lot of attention both by the press and by the public. I wondered if there was equal coverage but different reactions by the public, or if the coverage itself was unequal. I also wondered if level of coverage would change depending on the geographic proximity of the publication to the attack. As a type of warfare that directly affects civilian lives, terrorist attacks have come under close monitoring by news agencies around the world. To Americans, terror atrocities seem to be rare and isolated events. In reality, there are terror attacks happening weekly, even daily, in places around the world, but this news does not reach Americans. This study will compare the coverage of 4 terrorist attacks in 4 different countries and explore the difference in coverage by the newspaper publications in United States, France, and Saudi Arabia. Through totaling articles covering specifically the terror event and articles just mentioning or related to the event, I have found that attacks in Western countries are covered more thoroughly and with more emotional rhetoric across all 3 publications, despite the paper's geographic proximity to the event. To monitor newspaper coverage, I used the database Factiva and searched for specific terms related to each individual terrorist attack. I limited the dates to a 2-week span, from the day of the attack until 14 days later. I chose this time span because I think it is an accurate time frame for how long news stories remain salient. I then combed through hundreds of articles, counting the number of times a terrorist attack had an entire article devoted to it. I did a separate tally for the number of times a terrorist attack was referenced. In order to compare the media reaction to terrorist attacks in different areas of the world, I chose to follow the coverage of 4 events in 4 different countries. The first event I chose was the bombing in Beirut, Lebanon, on November 12, 2015. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, claimed responsibility for the attack that killed 43 and injured many others. The next terrorist attack I chose happened just a day later. On November 13, 2015, ISIS coordinated an attack on Paris, France, that killed 130 and injured hundreds more. The third atrocity I chose to monitor was the Boko Haram attack on a small village in Nigeria called Delori. The January 30, 2016 attack killed 86, including many children. The final terrorist attack I chose to explore was the Brussels bombing on March 22, 2016. The double bombing in the airport in the metro of Brussels was orchestrated by ISIS and killed 32 civilians. After choosing which terrorist attack to monitor, I next chose which publications I wanted to follow. Having an idea of the American reaction to these terrorist attacks, I first chose to follow the New York Times. Because of its connection to Paris and Brussels, as well as my background with the French language, I also chose to follow coverage by the French newspaper Le Monde. The last newspaper I chose was closer to the Beirut bombing and is based in Saudi Arabia. I chose to follow Arab news because of its geographic location. However, restrained by my language skills, I worry that I have chosen a paper that natives might not follow as closely. Unsurprisingly, I found that for the New York Times and Le Monde, the terrorist attacks in Brussels and Paris received the heaviest coverage in the 2-week span. In the New York Times, the coverage for Paris and Brussels was nearly 20 times greater than the coverage of Nigeria and Beirut combined. In Le Monde, the Paris attacks had at least 204 articles written chronicling the details of the attack, including logistics, follow-up investigations, and pieces memorializing the victims. The same array of articles was written in the New York Times about the Paris attacks and the Brussels bombing, but articles on Nigeria and Beirut simply reported the basic facts without follow-up or memorial pieces. I was surprised to see that so few articles were written by the Arab news specifically about the Beirut bombings, considering the proximity of the publication to the location of the attack. In the count for the articles specifically about the attack and the articles referencing the attack, the Arab news had published more articles about Paris than it had about Beirut. Ironically, out of the 2 articles Arab news published specifically about the Beirut bombings, the first article was in response to the lack of coverage it was receiving from Paris, which just happened 1 day later. Overall, the same patterns of reporting for articles of specificity were carried over to articles just referencing the attacks, with Paris and Brussels leading in all publications except for Arab News' coverage of Brussels, which was virtually non-existent. I also looked at the language and types of articles written about the 4 attacks. There was more variation in the type of articles written about Paris and Brussels, which included reporting the attack, the world's reactions to the attack, memorial articles, and follow-up investigations. In comparison, the meek coverage of Beirut and Nigeria only chronicled the specifics of the attacks, like how many people died or were injured and who was responsible. The language used in the articles by all 3 publications was also much stronger for Paris than it was for Beirut, and it was virtually non-existent for Nigeria. In the New York Times article, Gloves Off, director of the CIA Fault Surveillance Curbs, the writer called the attack in Beirut just a suicide bombing, but the one in Paris was described as a ghastly assault. The Boko Haram rampage was called a raid by the New York Times, while another reporter at the New York Times was, quote, reeling in horror, quote, in response to Brussels. A headline in Arab News read, Daesh's barbaric act, in reference to Paris. In another article titled, Countering a New Form of Warfare, Arab News writes, The Beirut Bombings and Now Paris Carnage. A Le Monde headline translates to Paris hit by apocalyptic terrorism. In conclusion, I found that geographic proximity does not play as large a role as the identity of the audience in determining what gets covered by newspapers, as seen in the coverage by Arab News. Although they were geographically closer to Beirut, their English readers might identify more with the Western countries. It would be interesting to see coverage by a newspaper in Arabic in Saudi Arabia, and see how it differs from the Arab News coverage. Journalists and readers also need to be more mindful of atrocities that occur in other areas around the world. By covering certain events more thoroughly than others, we are sending a message to the world that some human lives are more valuable or important than others. Logistically, newspapers need better resource allocation around the world in order to cover the stories of all people, not just those we are similar to. This means having a stronger presence in different regions like Africa or the Middle East. And lastly, the language and stories needs to be more consistent across atrocities. Readers need to be connected to other atrocities not just intellectually by having the story reported, but also emotionally, through similar language and breadth and type of article written.